Rain lashed against David's cracked windshield as he dreaded the evening ahead. He had no idea the stranded woman he was about to rescue on this desolate highway was the exact blind date he was trying to avoid, setting off a chain reaction that would change both their lives. David Sterling gripped the wheel of his battered 1998 Ford F-150. Knuckles pale as rain hammered the roof in a relentless Seattle downpour. At 34, he was a skilled mechanic, barely keeping his shop. Sterling Restorations, alive on the rough edges of Bellevue, and a single father to 7-year-old Emma, the only light in his worn-down world. Tonight, he traded his grease-stained coveralls for a faded charcoal suit, one he hadn't worn since his bitter divorce. His ex-wife had left behind debt and a drained savings account after a brutal custody fight. He had kept Emma, but now the bank was closing in, threatening to take the shop his father had built. Amidst this heavy reality, his well-meaning but overbearing sister, Rachel, had relentlessly badgered him into a blind date. You cannot spend the rest of your life married to carburetors, transmission fluid, and mounting bills. Rachel had scolded him over the phone just 2 hours prior. Her name is Tori. She works in corporate management. She's smart, she's successful, and she desperately needs a good guy who doesn't wear a Patagonia fleece vest and talk about stock portfolios all night. Just show up at La Sense by 7, please, for me. La Sense. The name alone made David's stomach churn. It was a notoriously pretentious French restaurant downtown, where a single appetizer cost more than his weekly grocery budget. He had $50 in his wallet and a maxed-out credit card. He dreaded the impending awkwardness, the inevitable moment when this Tory would ask what he did for a living, and he would have to watch her eyes glaze over with polite, thinly veiled disappointment. Meanwhile, 10 miles away, on a winding, affluent stretch of road bordering Mercer Island, Victoria Harrington was experiencing her own private nightmare. At 32, Victoria was the ruthlessly efficient CEO of Harrington Global Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and technology conglomerate. She had spent her afternoon dismantling a rival firm in a hostile boardroom takeover that secured the acquisition of the historic Pendleton Tower, leaving her adversaries, particularly a conniving board member named Richard Carmichael, entirely speechless. Yet, despite her immense wealth and unchallenged power, she felt utterly hollow and profoundly isolated. Her closest confidant and PR director, Jessica, had ambushed her with this blind date setup. "You need a tether to the real world, Vic," Jessica had insisted, sliding a thick, embossed reservation card across her mahogany desk. "He's a hard-working, salt-of-the-earth guy, a single dad, no agenda, no corporate backstabbing, no gold-digging motives, just a genuine man. Consider it a mandatory mental health exercise before you completely burn out." Victoria hated the idea. She despised vulnerability and loathed the thought of sitting across from some well-meaning but hopelessly out-of-his-depth blue-collar saint who would inevitably be intimidated by her empire. In a rare act of rebellion against her suffocating, heavily guarded lifestyle, she had dismissed her private security detail and chosen to drive herself to the date in her prized possession. A pristine, British Racing Green 1969 Jaguar E-Type. It was a spectacular mistake. Classic cars, as beautiful as they were, possessed temperaments that rivaled the most demanding divas. As she navigated a sharp, tree-canopied curve, the Jaguar gave a violent, mechanical shudder. A dreadful knocking sound echoed from the engine bay, followed by a sudden, complete loss of power. The sleek vehicle coasted to a pathetic halt on the gravel shoulder, miles away from a gas station, swallowed by the encroaching darkness and the relentless storm. Victoria slammed her hands against the polished mahogany steering wheel, a very un-CEO-like curse escaping her lips. She grabbed her smartphone, only to find the signal completely dead in this secluded, heavily wooded dip in the island's topography. She was stranded, wearing a customized $3,000 silk dress by Alexander McQueen, shivering as the damp chill seeped through the uninsulated classic car. Back on the main highway, Interstate 90 traffic had completely stalled due to a massive pileup ahead. Checking his cracked dashboard clock 6:15 p.m., David let out an exasperated sigh and took the next exit, deciding to cut through Mercer Island to reach downtown Seattle. He knew the back roads like the back of his hand from his teenage years. It was a risky, winding detour, but it was his absolute only chance of making it to Lassance before 7. As his headlights pierced the thick sheets of rain along the desolate road, the bright beams caught the unmistakable reflection of chrome. David slowed his heavy truck. There, slightly off-kilter, on the narrow shoulder, sat the elongated, elegant silhouette of a Jaguar E-Type. David's mechanical instincts flared instantly. It was a masterpiece of automotive engineering, and seeing it stranded in the mud felt like a crime. More importantly, he knew that leaving anyone stranded on this particular stretch of road in this brutal weather was incredibly dangerous. Despite knowing that stopping would almost certainly guarantee he would be late for his dreaded date, his conscience simply wouldn't allow him to drive past. He pulled his Ford over, the heavy tires crunching loudly against the gravel, and flipped on his hazard lights. Victoria jumped at the sudden, harsh illumination, flooding her rearview mirror. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Years of high-profile security briefings had conditioned her to view every unexpected encounter as a potential threat. She reached into her designer purse, her fingers closing tightly around a sleek, concealed canister of pepper spray, and watched as a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out of the rusted pickup truck. The man pulled his jacket collar up against the driving rein and jogged toward her window. He didn't look like a kidnapper or an opportunistic corporate spy. He looked exasperated, thoroughly soaked, and oddly rugged, in a suit that had seen better days. David tapped lightly on the glass. "You okay in there?" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Victoria hesitated, her grip on the pepper spray tightening, then lowered the window just 2 inches. The sharp smell of wet asphalt and pine flooded the luxurious cabin. "I'm perfectly fine," she lied automatically, her tone icy, practiced, and deeply authoritative. "My security team is en route." David raised a skeptical eyebrow, water dripping from his dark hair onto the bridge of his nose. He glanced at the completely dead dashboard, the lack of a glowing radio dial, then back at her. "Right. Well, unless your security team consists of a tow truck that can bend the laws of space and time, you're going to be waiting a long while. The main highway is backed up for miles. Pop the hood." "Excuse me?" Victoria bristled. She was a billionaire who controlled boardrooms with a single glance. She wasn't used to taking blunt orders from anyone, let alone a dripping wet stranger in the pouring rain. "The hood," David repeated, his voice patient but carrying a firm authority of its own. "It's a '69 E-Type. Beautiful car, an absolute classic, but they are notorious for electrical gremlins in the wet. Let me take a quick look. Unless you prefer freezing to death in an Alexander McQueen dress." Victoria blinked, genuinely startled. Not only had he correctly identified the specific year and model of her vintage car in the dark, but he had recognized the designer of her dress just from the neckline. Intrigued and undeniably freezing, her curiosity overrode her caution. She reached down and pulled the heavy latch. David walked to the front of the car, lifted the long, heavy clamshell hood, and pulled a small, heavy-duty, waterproof flashlight from his coat pocket. Victoria watched him through the rain-streaked windshield. He moved with a practiced, confident efficiency, his hands navigating the complex engine bay without hesitation. After a moment, she couldn't stand sitting uselessly inside while someone else did the work. She grabbed the large, golf-sized umbrella from the passenger seat, pushed open her heavy door, and stepped out into the biting storm. She walked over and silently positioned the umbrella over him, shielding him and the exposed engine bay from the worst of the deluge. David glanced up, wiping rain from his eyes, surprised by the gesture. "Thanks. You really didn't have to come out here. It's freezing. I don't like being a passive bystander to my own problems," Victoria said crisply, holding the umbrella steady. "What's the verdict?" "Distributor cap," David said immediately, pointing his flashlight to a small, cylindrical component near the engine block. Moisture got inside the casing. It's incredibly common with these old British engines. It's shorting out the spark, which is why you lost power. He pulled a clean, dry rag from his back pocket and began carefully disassembling and drying the delicate internal components. "Can you actually fix it here?" she asked, skepticism coloring her tone. "Temporarily. Enough to get you back to civilization, at least." He wiped his hands on the rag, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "It's your lucky day, honestly. You managed to break down in front of a mechanic who actually respects and understands vintage machinery." "Lucky is not the word I would use to describe tonight," Victoria muttered, her teeth chattering slightly as a gust of wind hit them. "I'm supposed to be at a dinner I absolutely dread, and now I'm going to walk in looking like a drowned rat." David chuckled, a deep, rich sound that surprised Victoria and momentarily warmed the freezing air. "Join the club. I'm currently on my way to the most agonizing blind date of my life." Victoria looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Beneath the rain-plastered hair and the slightly ill-fitting suit, he possessed a rugged, undeniably handsome face. His jawline was sharp, but his eyes were incredibly kind and grounded. "A blind date? Let me guess. She's awful." "I haven't met her yet, but my sister set it up. Apparently, she's some high-strung, high-level corporate manager," David said, carefully reattaching the dried distributor cap and tightening the screws. "Probably spends her weekends analyzing spreadsheets, firing people, and judging everyone's footwear. I'm a mechanic with a young kid and a struggling business. We have absolutely zero in common. I'm just bracing myself for 2 hours of polite condescension." Victoria felt a bizarre, sharp twinge of defensive guilt, even though he had no idea he was talking about her world. "Maybe you're being far too judgmental," she countered, her tone defensive. "Maybe this corporate manager is just exhausted. Maybe she's surrounded by sycophants all day and just wants a conversation with someone real." David paused his work, looking up at her thoughtfully, the flashlight illuminating the space between them. "Maybe. But why would someone like that want to have dinner with a guy whose truck is held together by duct tape and prayers?" "Because," Victoria said softly, her icy exterior cracking just a fraction as she met his gaze, "sometimes the people with the duct tape are the only ones who actually know how to fix things when they fall apart." David held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. An undeniable electric tension passed between them, cutting cleanly through the freezing rain and the noise of the storm. He cleared his throat, suddenly hyper-aware of how close they were standing, and looked back at the engine. "Well, let's see if this fix holds." He slammed the clamshell hood shut. "Try turning her over." Victoria slid back into the leather driver's seat and turned the silver key. The inline-six engine coughed, sputtered for a terrifying second, and then roared to life, settling into a smooth, powerful, throaty idle. A massive wave of relief washed over her. She stepped back out into the rain, pulling a crisp, monogrammed silk handkerchief from her coat pocket. She offered it to him. "For your hands. Thank you. Truly. I would have been stranded here all night." David looked at the luxurious fabric, then down at his grease-stained, rough hands. "I'll completely ruin it." "Consider it a casualty of war," she insisted, stepping forward and pressing it directly into his palm. "I'm Victoria. Well, my friends call me Tori." She caught herself, surprised. She practically never offered her nickname to strangers. "Dave," he replied, accepting the cloth, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "Drive safe, Tori. Take the corners slow. The roads are incredibly slick." "Good luck with your terrifying corporate manager, Dave," she said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips, the first real smile she had worn in weeks. "Good luck with your dreaded dinner," he returned, turning back toward his truck. They parted ways. The rusted Ford F-150 and the vintage Jaguar disappearing into the stormy night in opposite directions, neither of them realizing that the brief, honest connection they had just shared on the side of a desolate highway was with the very person they were both so desperately dreading to meet. Inside Lessons, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. Heavy, crimson velvet drapes effectively smothered the chaotic sounds of the Seattle storm raging outside, replacing the drumming rain with the soft, melodic hum of a live string quartet. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables dressed in pristine white linen, illuminating the city's elite as they dined on truffle-infused delicacies. David felt the acute, uncomfortable weight of the room the second he crossed the threshold. His charcoal suit, which had seemed perfectly acceptable in the dim light of his hallway mirror, now felt glaringly cheap, the fabric stiff and hopelessly outdated compared to the bespoke Armani and Tom Ford jackets surrounding him. He self-consciously brushed a lingering drop of rainwater from his lapel and approached the maitre d's podium. "Reservation for Harrington," David mumbled, his voice tight. The maitre d', a sharply dressed man whose name tag read Claude, slowly dragged his gaze over David's slightly damp hair and grease-stained fingernails. A flicker of thinly veiled disdain crossed his impeccably groomed features. "Ah, yes, Miss Harrington's table. Right this way, sir." David was led to a secluded, semicircular booth near the back, overlooking the rain-slicked glass of the restaurant's massive windows facing Elliott Bay. He slid into the plush leather seating, feeling entirely like a trespasser. When the sommelier approached, offering a leather-bound wine list thicker than a telephone directory, David politely declined and ordered a tap water. He checked his cracked phone screen. 7:15 p.m. He hoped this Tory would just stand him up so he could go home, heat up some leftover mac and cheese for Emma, and forget this humiliating evening ever happened. 10 minutes later, a subtle shift occurred near the front entrance. The low murmur of conversation in the dining room dipped, and even the string quartet seemed to play a fraction softer. Victoria Harrington had arrived. She had managed to dry her hair in the car's heating vents, and though her Alexander McQueen dress was slightly damp at the hem, she carried herself with the undeniable, commanding presence of a woman who owned every room she walked into. Claude, the previously haughty maitre d', practically fell over himself as he rushed forward to greet her, his demeanor transforming into a masterclass in obsequious fawning. "Miss Harrington! An absolute honor to have you this evening. Your guest has already arrived." "Please, allow me," Claude gushed, taking her damp coat. Victoria offered a tight, polite nod, her stomach tying itself into a series of complicated knots. She had spent the remainder of her drive mentally preparing a polite but firm exit strategy. She would stay for one drink, exchange pleasantries, blame an early morning board meeting regarding the Pendleton Tower acquisition, and leave. She followed Claude through the maze of tables. As they approached the secluded booth overlooking the bay, the man sitting there turned his head toward her. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hand reached out and, instinctively gripping the back of an empty chair for balance, David's jaw slackened. The glass of tap water he had been holding slipped a fraction of an inch in his grip before he hastily set it down on the linen tablecloth. He stared at the striking woman standing before him, the very same woman whose vintage Jaguar he had just resurrected on a muddy shoulder of Mercer Island. "Dave?" Victoria whispered, the sheer shock momentarily stripping away her polished CEO facade. "Tory?" David replied, his voice a mixture of profound disbelief and sudden, undeniable amusement. Claude looked between the two of them, thoroughly confused. "I see you are already acquainted. I will send your server over immediately." He bowed hastily and retreated. Victoria slowly slid into the booth opposite him. She stared at him for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, a laugh, a genuine, uninhibited sound, escaped her lips. You are the hard-working, salt-of-the-earth single dad my PR director tried to sell me on." A wide grin broke across David's face, reaching his eyes. The suffocating anxiety he had felt just moments before instantly vanished. "And you are the terrifying, high-strung corporate manager my sister warned me about. Though, to be fair, she didn't mention you drove a '69 E-Type. Or that I'd be completely helpless on the side of Interstate 90, Victoria added, shaking her head in disbelief. "I cannot believe this." "Of all the people to pull over—" "I told you," David said, leaning back in his chair, suddenly feeling much more comfortable in his faded suit. "It was your lucky day." The shared absurdity of the situation shattered the remaining ice between them. The initial dread that had clouded both their evenings evaporated, replaced by a crackling electric curiosity. "So," David said, folding his hands on the table, "Tory, What exactly does a corporate manager do that affords a $3,000 Alexander McQueen dress and a classic Jaguar? Victoria hesitated. She usually hid her true status on the rare dates she endured, terrified of the inevitable shift in a man's demeanor when he realized her net worth. But looking at David, a man who had stood in the freezing rain to fix her engine without asking for a dime, a man who clearly didn't care about the pretentious atmosphere of l'essence, she felt an unfamiliar urge to just be honest. "I'm not exactly a manager, Dave," she said softly. "My full name is Victoria Harrington. I'm the CEO of Harrington Global Holdings." David blinked. He wasn't a corporate insider, but you couldn't live in Seattle without knowing the Harrington name. They owned half the skyline. They were the invisible hand behind massive tech integrations and real estate developments across the Pacific Northwest. He let out a low whistle. "Billionaire CEO. Oh, okay. I guess that explains the maitre d' treating you like visiting royalty." "Does it bother you?" Victoria asked, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable, bracing herself for the familiar look of intimidation or opportunistic greed she had seen in so many men's eyes. David looked at her thoughtfully. "Honestly, it makes me retroactively terrified I didn't tighten the distributor cap screws enough. If that Jaguar breaks down again, I'm pretty sure your lawyers will take my shop." Victoria let out a startled, genuine laugh. "I promise, my legal team has strict orders not to sue my mechanics." Their server arrived, delivering 2 menus that looked more like ancient, leather-bound grimoires. As David opened his, the blood drained from his face. A simple filet mignon was listed at a staggering $180. A side of asparagus was $40. He swallowed hard, the harsh reality of their differing worlds suddenly slamming back into him. He had $50 in his wallet. Victoria, possessing the hyper-observant instincts that made her a lethal negotiator in the boardroom, noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw and the slight widening of his eyes. She instantly understood. Before the waiter could even raise his pen, Victoria closed her menu. "Actually, Antoine," she said smoothly, using her authoritative boardroom voice, "we won't be ordering dinner tonight. Mr. Sterling and I have some urgent business to discuss elsewhere. Just a bottle of the 15 Chateau Margaux for the table. Please, put it on my usual account." David looked at her, stunned. "Tori, you don't have to." "I know I don't," she interrupted gently, leaning across the table once the waiter left. "But I despise this restaurant. The food is pretentious, the portions are microscopic, and half the people in this room are actively plotting against the other half. I only agreed to come here because it was a neutral, heavily public zone." "It's definitely public," David agreed, profoundly grateful for her tact. "But what about the wine?" "It's a prop," she winked, "to keep them from kicking us out while we talk." And talk they did. Stripped of the usual blind date pretenses, their conversation flowed with a surprising, refreshing ease. David found himself opening up about Emma, describing her obsession with building intricate Lego engines and her fierce, messy attempts at painting. He talked about his father's legacy, sterling restorations, and the heavy, exhausting burden of trying to keep the business afloat in an increasingly corporate, digitized world. Victoria listened with rapt attention. She didn't offer hollow pity or unsolicited business advice. She simply listened, her eyes locked on his, deeply moved by his quiet resilience and his fierce love for his daughter. In turn, she found herself confessing things she had never told anyone else. She spoke about the crushing isolation of her position, the constant, exhausting paranoia of boardroom betrayals, and the heavy burden of carrying thousands of employees' livelihoods on her shoulders. "It sounds," David said quietly, swirling the untouched water in his glass, "like we're both just trying to keep engines running that are constantly threatening to overheat." Victoria smiled, a soft, genuine expression. "That is the most accurate assessment of my life I've ever heard." Suddenly, a shadow fell over their table. "Victoria, darling, what an absolutely shocking surprise to see you slumming it." Victoria's smile vanished instantly. She looked up, her expression hardening into absolute ice. Standing next to their booth was Richard Carmichael, the rival board member she had brutally outmaneuvered that very afternoon. He was wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a smug, venomous smile playing on his lips. Two equally sleazy-looking investors stood a few paces behind him. "Richard," Victoria said, her voice dropping 10 degrees, "I see you haven't choked on your own bile yet today. It's a miracle." Richard chuckled, though the sound was entirely devoid of warmth. He turned his attention to David, his eyes raking over the faded charcoal suit with obvious theatrical disdain. "And who is this? Surely not a new acquisition, Victoria. He looks a bit depreciated." "Don't tell me Harrington Global has started a charity division for the city's blue-collar unfortunates." Victoria's hands curled into tight fists under the table. The sudden, fierce urge to throw her glass of water in Richard's face was nearly overwhelming. "Richard, you will leave this table immediately before I make sure." "It's all right, Tori," David interrupted smoothly. He didn't shrink under Richard's insulting gaze. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered, his eyes calmly assessing the billionaire rival. David looked at the gold Rolex Daytona gleaming on Richard's wrist. "Nice watch," David noted casually. "Though, if you're going to wear a Daytona, you should really have the mainspring serviced. The second hand is lagging by about a quarter of a beat. Usually means the internal lubrication has completely dried out. It happens when someone buys an expensive machine just to show off, rather than actually taking care of it." Richard's smug smile faltered, his face flushing a violent shade of red. He instinctively covered his watch with his opposite hand. "Excuse me?" "I'm just saying," David continued, his voice calm, steady, and utterly devastating in its simplicity. "You can dress up a rusted chassis in a $10,000 paint job, but anyone who actually knows what they're looking at can still hear the engine knocking. Have a good evening, Richard." The two investors behind Richard stifled quiet coughs, awkwardly looking away. Richard, thoroughly humiliated and entirely unequipped to verbally spar with someone who didn't play by high society rules, glared venomously at David. "Enjoy your charity dinner," he spat, before turning on his heel and storming away. Victoria stared at David, completely awestruck. In all her years in the corporate world, she had never seen anyone dismantle Richard Carmichael with such effortless, grounded precision. "You," she breathed, a spark of pure admiration igniting in her chest, "are incredibly dangerous, Dave. I deal with stubborn, overinflated tires every single day at the shop." David grinned. He was an easy read. He looked around the opulent, stifling room, suddenly feeling claustrophobic. "You know what? You were right. This place is terrible." Victoria reached across the table, acting on pure, unadulterated impulse, and grabbed his hand. Her skin was warm against his calloused palm. "Let's get out of here." "Where to?" David asked, his heart hammering against his ribs as he let her pull him up from the booth. "You mentioned your daughter likes burgers," Victoria said, her eyes practically shining as they navigated through the maze of tables toward the exit. "I happen to know a place downtown that makes the greasiest, most spectacular bacon cheeseburger in Seattle, and I am buying." The rain had finally reduced to a misty drizzle by the time David's rusted Ford F-150 pulled into the gravel parking lot of Mick's all-night diner. It was a stark, unapologetic contrast to the velvet-draped pretension of l'essence. Here, the primary sources of illumination were a flickering neon sign that buzzed like an angry hornet and the harsh fluorescent lights hanging over cracked red vinyl booths. The air was thick with the comforting, heavy aroma of frying onions, seasoned beef, and black coffee. Victoria stepped out of the truck, her $3,000 Alexander McQueen dress brushing against the damp gravel. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath of the greasy air, a look of profound relief washing over her striking features. As they walked inside, the bell above the door jingled cheerfully. Mick, a burly man with a thick beard and an apron covered in flour, looked up from the grill. "Davy! Haven't seen you in a month of Sundays? Usual? Make it 2. "Mick," David called out, guiding Victoria to a corner booth, "and double the bacon on both." Victoria slid into the vinyl seat, the material squeaking slightly. She looked entirely out of place, yet utterly at ease. When Mick brought over 2 massive, glistening burgers, accompanied by a mountain of golden fries, Victoria didn't hesitate. She picked up the burger with both hands, took a massive bite, and closed her eyes in pure, unadulterated bliss. "Oh my God," she mumbled, grabbing a paper napkin to catch a stray drop of sauce. "That is spectacular. License could never." David chuckled, watching her shed the rigid, icy armor she had worn at the restaurant. Under the harsh diner lights, with her hair slightly messy from the rain and a smudge of ketchup near her thumb, she was breathtakingly beautiful. The intimidating billionaire CEO had vanished, leaving behind a woman who was fiercely intelligent, surprisingly funny, and deeply exhausted by the weight of her own world. "So," David said, stealing a fry from her basket, "you run a multi-billion-dollar empire, you drive a temperamental classic car, and you aggressively defend blue-collar mechanics against snobby board members. Who exactly is Victoria Harrington?" Victoria wiped her mouth, her expression turning thoughtful. "She's someone who spends 90% of her time playing a high-stakes game of chess, where she doesn't actually like any of the other players. I inherited the company from my grandfather. He taught me how to be ruthless, how to build walls, and how to never show weakness. But lately," she paused, looking down at her hands, "lately, the walls just feel like a prison. I'm tired of everything being transactional." She looked up, meeting his eyes with a vulnerability that stole the breath from his lungs. "What about you, Dave? Why keep fighting a losing battle with a struggling garage when you could easily take a corporate mechanic job and have financial security?" Because of the history, David answered honestly, his voice low and steady. "My dad built sterling restorations from the ground up. He taught me that when something is broken, you don't just throw it away. You take the time to understand it, you find the damaged parts, and you put in the labor to bring it back to life. There's a soul in those old machines. I want to show my daughter, Emma, that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you." Victoria reached across the chipped formica table, her fingers gently brushing against his. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to his chest. "I think Emma is incredibly lucky to have a father who understands the value of fixing things rather than discarding them." They sat in the diner for hours, drinking terrible drip coffee and talking until the neon sign outside finally buzzed out. They talked about their childhoods, their spectacular failures, and the quiet, hidden dreams they rarely voiced out loud. For the first time in years, David didn't feel the crushing weight of his debts. And Victoria didn't feel the suffocating pressure of her empire. They were just two exhausted people who had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other. When David finally dropped her off at her sprawling gated estate overlooking Lake Washington, the early morning light was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Victoria stood on the illuminated driveway, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "Thank you, Dave, for fixing my car. For saving me from license. For the burger, just thank you." "Anytime, Tori," David said softly, leaning out the window of his truck. "And hey, if the Jaguar acts up again, you know where to find me." "I do," she smiled, a promise lingering in her eyes. "I really do." 3 days later, reality had crashed back down on David with the force of a sledgehammer. He was standing in the dimly lit bay of Sterling Restorations, staring at a final notice of foreclosure from the bank. His hands, covered in a fresh layer of motor oil, trembled slightly. He had exactly 2 weeks to come up with $40,000, or he would lose the shop, his father's legacy, and his primary means of providing for Emma. Emma, oblivious to the impending disaster, was sitting on a sturdy stool near his workbench, humming happily as she snapped together a complex Lego spaceship. David rubbed his tired eyes, fighting the rising tide of panic in his throat. He hadn't heard from Victoria since he dropped her off. He told himself it was for the best. Cinderella stories didn't happen to guys who smelled like WD-40. She was back in her ivory tower, and he was sinking in his grease pit. Suddenly, a familiar, deep, throaty roar echoed off the brick walls of the garage. David turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Pulling into the sunlit driveway of the shop was the pristine British Racing Green 1000, 969 Jaguar E-Type. The engine cut out, and the heavy door swung open. Victoria stepped out, but she wasn't wearing a designer silk dress or a tailored boardroom suit. She was wearing well-fitted denim jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and a weathered leather jacket. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely at home in the gritty surroundings of the industrial park. She walked into the garage, her heels clicking purposefully against the concrete floor. She spotted Emma immediately and smiled, crouching down to eye level with the little girl. "That is a very impressive spaceship," Victoria noted warmly. "Are those the new hyperdrive thrusters?" Emma beamed, holding up the colorful plastic construction. "Yeah, my dad says if you don't build the engine right, the whole ship falls apart." "Your dad is a very smart man," Victoria said, standing up and turning her gaze to David. Her eyes held a mixture of fierce determination and gentle affection. David wiped his hands on a rag. Stepping forward, his mind reeling. "Tori, what are you doing here?" Victoria reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder, dropping it onto his cluttered workbench, right next to the bank's foreclosure notice. "I have a massive problem, Dave," Victoria stated, her tone shifting into a professional but distinctly playful cadence. "Harrington Global has an executive fleet of over 50 vehicles, not to mention my personal collection of 12 vintage European sports cars. For the last 2 years, our corporate maintenance contract has been handled by a massive dealership that overcharges, underdelivers, and doesn't know the difference between a distributor cap and a coffee cup." David stared at the folder, his breath hitching. "What is this?" "That," Victoria said, tapping the folder, "is a 3-year exclusive fleet maintenance and restoration contract. It comes with a substantial upfront retainer, more than enough to clear any, say, banking misunderstandings this shop might currently be facing." David was entirely speechless. He looked from the contract to Victoria, a wave of pride and hesitation warring in his chest. "Tori, I can't take a handout. I won't." "It is categorically not a handout," Victoria countered firmly, stepping closer to him, invading his personal space in the best possible way. "I am a businesswoman, David. I do not make bad investments. I saw firsthand how you handled my Jaguar in the middle of a torrential downpour. I watched you diagnose a mechanical failure by sound alone. You are a master of your craft. I need the best, and you are the best. This is a mutually beneficial corporate acquisition of your services." She paused, her professional mask melting away, leaving only the woman from the diner. She reached out, her clean hands gently gripping his oil-stained fingers. "Plus," she whispered, her eyes searching his, "I really wanted an excuse to see you again, and I figured you wouldn't accept an invitation back to l'essence." A slow, brilliant smile broke across David's face, completely banishing the shadows of stress that had haunted him all morning. He looked down at their joined hands, the stark contrast between their worlds blurring into something beautiful and real. "You're right," David murmured, stepping closer until he could smell the faint hint of expensive perfume mixed with the shop's metallic tang. "I hate that restaurant, but I know a great little place that makes a terrible drip coffee. It's a date," Victoria smiled, leaning in. As their lips finally met in the dusty, sunlit garage, surrounded by half-built engines and the hopeful hum of a little girl playing with Lego blocks, David knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the most beautiful things in life weren't the ones that came perfectly assembled off a showroom floor. They were the things you found stranded in the dark, the things you took the time to understand, and the things you built together, piece by piece. If you loved this story about unexpected love, second chances, and the beauty of fixing what's broken, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true connections happen when you least expect them. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming, dramatic stories delivered straight to your feed every single week.
Hi, my name is Shalom Royal Hunger, the owner and manager of Shalom Royal Hunger. After watching the video, single dad fixed woman's car on way to blind date. Not knowing she was the date he dreaded, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the mix of humor, surprise, and unexpected connection. The story plays with first impressions and reminds us that people often turn out to be very different from what we imagine. Sometimes the moments we least look forward to end up becoming the most memorable ones. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that keeping an open mind can lead to unexpected opportunities in relationships. It's easy to form opinions before truly getting to know someone, but real understanding usually comes from shared experiences. Did your opinion of either character change as the story unfolded? And what was your favorite moment in the story? Maybe there's a small reminder here to give people a chance before deciding who they are. You never know when an unexpected encounter might brighten your day. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like or subscribe. Thanks for watching and spending part of your day with us.